In this three-part video, you will learn about how to find bills and trace them as they pass through Parliament. In the first part, we will look at what bills are and how we identify them. In the second part, we'll look at how bills are passed, and finally, in the third part, we'll learn how to follow a bill through Parliament. Now let's look at how bills are passed. It is important to know how the system works before we look at how we follow a bill as it moves through Parliament. We're going to look at an example of a bill moving through the House of Commons, but do not worry, everything you see here will be explained in Part 3, and by the end of Part 3, you'll know how to find any tool that you need in order to research bills on your own. To become a law, a bill must be considered and approved 3 times by both chambers. Certain set things also happen during and between these stages. Normally, the first reading or consideration is a formality. It's deemed read without debate. At the second consideration, the debate begins, and usually the motion is to favorably consider the bill a second time and then refer it to a committee. At this point, if the bill passes, it is then considered by a committee, which may or may not hold public hearings, receive testimony, and so on, with a view towards recommending any changes to the legislation. At the conclusion of their work, the committee reports back to the parent body, which then considers the report and the recommendations contained in it. They can agree to all of the recommendations, they can decide on them on a point-by-point basis, they can reject the committee's work, or they can send it back to the committee for further consideration. In the first 2 cases, once the report is dealt with, they immediately go to a third reading, and then, if the bill passes a third time, it is sent to the other chamber where it undergoes much the same process. For the first reading, there is normally no debate. For government bills, the bill is introduced and it is deemed read all at once. Nobody even speaks. For private members' bills, normally the MP speaks briefly on the purpose of the bill when it's introduced, and senators may also, when a bill is introduced in the Senate, say a few words before the bill is actually deemed to have been read the first time. Here's an example. Now, notice here that Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of International Trade, was responsible for the bill, but she was not in the House at the time, and so it was introduced by someone else, but on her behalf. The bill is deemed read, and the Speaker orders that it be printed. Normally, this is the first time the public gets to read the text. This version, by the way, is not necessarily what will pass, and it will be printed again, possibly many times, if a lot of changes are made as it moves through Parliament. The bill then undergoes second reading, and the debate here is fuller, acrimonious at times, and can go on for several days. If the bill is passed, it is usually sent to a committee for further consideration, and we move away from chamber documentation and we now look at the documents that are generated by the committees. So let's look at the second reading here. Notice the date, June 15. And here's the start of the second reading. It begins with a motion to read it a second time and refer to a committee. Note also that the minister is still mentioned by title, but this time someone else is again making the motion on her behalf. A great deal of debate takes place here. In this case, they didn't wrap up the second reading until 2 months after they started. In fairness to the House of Commons, however, they adjourned for most of the summer. After a couple of days, the vote is taken, it passes. Sometimes the vote is recorded, sometimes not, as we see here, and then it goes to a committee. And in this case, specifically, the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade for the disposition was included in the motion, and we need to go and look at the committee material. At the committee stage, we're no longer in Parliament, but rather in a committee, and this is very important in terms of research. Committee will be made up of MPs in the case of a House of Commons committee, or senators in the case of a Senate committee. The committees will have different rules, different procedures, a discrete set of documents that are distinct from the documents of their parent body. The committee will examine the bill clause by clause. They may, if they deem it necessary or advantageous, receive internal or external testimony from individuals who are not members of the committee, and then at some point they will report back to the House or the Senate with their recommendations. The committee deliberations are very important for many reasons, one of which is that if you're looking for civil society or external input on a bill, it will usually happen and be recorded here. Eventually, the committee reports their findings back to the House or the Senate. Sometimes they simply say, "It looks good to us." Other times they recommend a few changes, as here. Rarely they make more drastic recommendations, and rarer still, they recommend the government not move forward. Regardless, their work is done for the time being, and is now back in the hands of Parliament. The House now looks at the bill in 2 stages, the report and third reading. In the former, they're only looking at the changes recommended by the committee, not at the bill itself. Once they've addressed the report, usually accepting it as a whole, sometimes modifying the recommendations, then accepting it, and then, or rarely, rejecting the report or sending it back for further consideration, they will move immediately to the third vote. This particular bill was not too complicated, so they simply voted to concur in or accept the changes and move on immediately to the vote on the version of the bill as amended by committee. The report here was accepted, and the House agreed to move to a third reading right away, and this is normal procedure. The third reading starts off with a motion, and this is the last chance for the opposition or anyone who disagrees with the bill to stop it, and so the debate here can be long and at times quite acrimonious. Eventually the bill is voted on, and having been considered or read 3 times in this case and passed all 3 times, the bill is now deemed to have passed in the House of Commons, and it is now sent to the Senate, where it undergoes essentially the same process. And so to summarize, bills are read 3 times. Normally a bill is sent to a committee for consideration after the second reading. The committee looks at it in detail and receives outside testimony if needed. Once a bill is read 3 times and passed, it is sent to the other chamber for consideration. Both chambers need to pass an identical version of the bill before it can become law. And this ends part 2.